Hi, everyone. Just to begin, I want to say a little bit about what Belongg is. So Belongg looks to make community services and experiences available to people from marginalized backgrounds, people who experience discrimination on the basis of identity. So that could be gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, disability, caste, which we're discussing today. And the Belongg Book Club and Library in particular, which is what today's event is, looks to feature authors who write on themes of identity, diversity, and inclusion. And we do our events every Wednesday and Friday, so you can learn more about that on our social media. But before I get started with introducing Ajantha, I just want to say a little bit about the format of today's session. So I'm going to introduce Ajantha, and then I'm just going to hand it over to her, and she's going to read a couple of excerpts from her book and sort of lay out the main points of her argument in this book. After which I'm going to ask her some questions because I really enjoyed what I read of her book, and I would love to talk her ear off. But because this is meant to be slightly more interactive, at some point we're going to be taking questions from all of you, maybe for the last 40 minutes or so. So hopefully we'll get questions from you closer to then. You can use the Q&A button below to send questions, and I'll relay them to Ajantha. And if you have anything to communicate that is not a question, you can use the chat button. And both of those can be found, I guess, somewhere under Ajantha's face, tentatively speaking. So that's all from me. I'm just going to introduce Ajantha very quickly. So Ajantha Subramanian is Professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at Harvard University. Her book, The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India, was published by Harvard University Press in 2019. And broadly speaking, it looks at the notion of merit in relation to caste, and it studies this by looking at the IITs. So over to you, Ajantha. You can tell us more about the book, and that we're all waiting to hear more about. So
great. Thanks, Manjri, and thanks so much for inviting me to do this session. I'm really honored to be a part of the Belongg book series. I've watched some of the previous author sessions, and they've all been really wonderful. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. So this book is it's a historical anthropology of engineering education in India, in which I look at the role of caste in the stratification of technical training from the colonial period to the present, and also at its centrality to a contemporary politics of merit. And I came to this project, I suppose, in part after just seeing the scramble for higher education in India as a kind of proven means to social mobility, and the fetishizing of engineering in particular as one of the most highly valued forms of knowledge. And I decided to focus the ethnography on the IITs because it's a site where both of these processes are so clearly evident. So what I'm going to do is first read a bit from the introduction of the book, where I lay out my main reasons for taking on this project, and some of the key arguments. And it's a fairly sort of dense excerpt. So what I'll do immediately after is flesh out some of the points in a little more depth. And then I'll read two more excerpts, one from the first chapter on the colonial period, and a second from the fifth chapter on testing, and the JEE as a sort of an example of a kind of mass examination. Okay, so let me go ahead and read the first excerpt from the introduction. The Caste of Merit chronicles the rise of engineering education in India in the context of older forms of social and economic stratification. More specifically, it illuminates the relationship between engineering education and caste formation. At the heart of the study are the Indian Institutes of Technology. Through a historical anthropology of Indian engineering education, the book tracks how the IITs and their predominantly upper caste graduates came to be seen as global exemplars of Indian technical knowledge. A key dimension of this story is the complex relationship between caste and merit. At first glance, the two terms appear antithetical. Caste is the social institution most emblematic of ascriptive hierarchy, while meritocracy is typically understood as a democratizing force that levels inherited privileges and disadvantages. When one looks at the uppermost echelon of higher educational institutions in India, however, caste and merit appear far more proximate, even intimate. 70-odd years after independence, the institutional spaces most identified as meritocratic, like the IITs, continue to be overwhelmingly upper caste in composition. Moreover, attempts at opening up these spaces to lower castes through affirmative action and other democratizing measures are consistently met with fervent opposition, not in the name of caste, but in the name of preserving merit. Part of my concern then is to understand how the democratic ideal of meritocracy services the reproduction of inequality. I analyze the interplay of ascription and achievement through which the collective inheritances of caste have become emblematic of individual merit. In doing so, I argue that social stratification is endemic and not anomalous to contemporary democracy. The intimacy between caste and merit throws into question the widespread assumption that identitarianism is principally a politics of the marginalized. In the Indian context, this assumption is reflected in arguments about caste as a more salient basis of social distinction and self-definition for lower than for upper caste. More specifically, upper caste urban professionals are thought to have transcended caste to adopt more modern forms of identification. Thus, they are assumed to be casteless by virtue of their modernity. In part, this is because since the 1970s, media and scholarly attention has been far more focused on how lower caste mobilization has transformed the contours of Indian society and politics. While attention to lower caste politics has illuminated the transformative potential of subaltern agency, it has also produced an equation between caste politics and subaltern identitarianism. As a result, the proliferation of writing on lower caste that points to caste as a socio-political category operating through various registers and at different scales has not led to similarly robust engagement with upper caste self-definition and maneuver. And this is where my work comes in. I look at the role of engineering education and the IITs in particular in producing newly consolidated forms of upper caste affiliation. The leveraging of merit, I argue, must be seen as an expression of upper caste identitarianism that attempts to forestall progress towards a more egalitarian society and derives its legitimacy from a larger global politics of ascription. While this book considers the IIT system as a whole, I focus my institutional ethnography on the study of one IIT, IIT Madras, located in Chennai, the capital city of the southeastern state of Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is a particularly illuminating context in which to look at the making of upper caste identity because its history of caste rights politics, in particular the non-Brahmin and Dravidian movements, complicated the naturalization of merit and the transformation of upper castes into casteless moderns. Here, as in other regions with strong traditions of lower caste rights, merit has long been understood as a product of historical privilege and not simply of innate ability. Moreover, Tamil Nadu is the first post-independent state where upper caste challenged measures to democratize access to higher education in the name of both their caste nature and their merit. In this sense, Tamil Nadu calls into question castelessness as a stable structure of post-independence upper caste subjectivity. While the legacy of lower caste rights movements within Tamil Nadu has been exhaustively addressed, less noted is how they have shaped a more far-reaching politics of meritocracy. This book showcases Tamil Nadu as an important precedent in a proliferating politics of meritocracy. It asks how the dialectic of lower caste claims to rights and upper caste claims to merit in Tamil Nadu might inform an analysis of caste more broadly. In foregrounding Tamil Nadu as a key site for the post-independence elaboration of meritocracy, the book calls for a relational approach to merit. Claims to merit, I will argue, must be understood as responses to subaltern assertion. Analyzing meritocracy in relation to subaltern politics allows us to see the contextual specificity of such claims. At one moment, they may be articulated through the disavowal of caste, at another, through caste affiliation. As I will show throughout the book, collective belonging and claims to merit are eminently commensurable and become more so when subaltern assertion forces historical privilege into the foreground. Far from the progressive erasure of ascribed identities in favor of putatively universal ones, then, what we are witnessing today is the re-articulation of caste as an explicit basis for merit. Moreover, this re-articulation is not simply the assertion of already constituted caste identities. Rather, claims to merit generated newly consolidated forms of upper casteness that become the basis for capital accumulation. This back and forth movement between the marking and unmarking of caste within claims to merit suggests the need for greater nuance in approaching the concept of meritocracy. Even the critical literature that illuminates the workings of caste, racial, or class privilege within seemingly meritocratic institutions ends up arguing for a better meritocracy, where individual talent is considered over and above social identity. By contrast, my work maintains that it's precisely this gap between the social life of meritocracy and its universalistic promise that allows for the retrenchment of privilege. The hope for meritocracy as the transcendence of identity is a profoundly ahistorical aspiration that works against the actual redress of inequality. Okay, so I know that that was fairly dense. So what I'm going to do before reading the two other excerpts is flesh out some of these arguments in a little more detail. So what the book shows is that merit is a term that works ideologically, and it works ideologically to mark a discontinuity, right? A kind of rupture with older forms of social organization where patronage and birth mattered more than individual ability and hard work, right? And so in this sense, meritocracy is part of a liberal common sense, which assumes that the institution of formal equality has actually leveled the playing field, right? And rendered these collective inheritances irrelevant. And that, so in other words, with the advent of democracy, your merit or individual ability is the only thing that now matters, right? And in the book, I show that this ideology of meritocracy actually obscures the role of caste inheritances in determining opportunity and achievement in India. And I also argue for engineering as a particularly revealing window onto this ideological work of meritocracy, because engineering is commonly taken to be a socially disembedded, kind of power-neutral form of knowledge, as well as a reliable social leveler, right? And all of this is taken for granted despite the fact that the history of engineering clearly shows both the workings of racial, caste, and class assumptions about who would or would not make a good engineer, and also the role of engineering as a form of knowledge that has been mobilized, right, in the service of state and corporate power. So across the book, I show that these assumptions about who would make a good engineer, who properly belongs on campuses like the IITs, how all of these assumptions are most clearly expressed through the operations of caste. And when I say operations of caste, I mean both how caste works on these campuses through these seemingly mundane things, right? Like dialect and food, music, dress, right? How all of these seemingly sort of mundane expressions of who one is actually work to distinguish legitimate from illegitimate IITians, right? And of course, there's also the way caste operates through more recognizably political stances. For instance, where one stands on the question of reservations, or on the question of Dravidianism, or on Hindutva, right? But these are more sort of explicitly political ways of sort of distinguishing forms of caste belonging. But there are also these other sort of less obviously political ways, right, in which caste belonging gets marked on these campuses. and becomes a means to distinguish kind of legitimate from illegitimate IITians. So, in all of these ways, I show how these supposedly modern, caste-free, apolitical institutions like the IITs are actually ridden through with caste power, where caste status and stigma are alive and well. But the book also argues that the politics of merit has itself been transformative, right? That the politics of merit has changed the terms of caste distinction and the scales of caste identification. So what do I mean by that? The last 3 chapters of the book look at 3 different processes of caste transformation. And these are mass examinations like the JEE, reservations, and transnational mobility. And so in each of these chapters, I look at how these processes have put into circulation new terms, new binary terms, through which caste difference has come to be understood, right? So binary terms such as the general versus the reserved, right? Which sort of emerges out of the debate around reservations. Or the gifted versus the coached, which comes out of the sort of debates around the JEE. And so these binary terms have become the sort of principal means through which caste difference has come to be understood and merit made into a form of upper caste property. So that's the first big point, right? The first big point that the book makes is that these terms index a new scale of difference where the categories that matter most are those of upper and lower caste, right? In other words, what we see in the opposition, right, between the general and the reserved, for instance, is that the smaller, more localized forms of caste, those practices of kind of fine-grained ranking that Ambedkar referred to as the graded inequality of caste, right? That those forms of caste have been superseded by these aggregated categories of upper and lower, right? That these have become the more salient markers of caste difference, at least in institutions like the IITs, right? And the second big point is that this new scale of caste difference, this consolidation of caste, has to be understood as a defensive reaction to processes of democratization, right? So part of my task in the book is to insist on the instability of meritocracy, right, as an expression of upper caste power, and to highlight this wider field of political conflict, of political contestation that makes the equation between being upper caste and having merit less of a given, right? Like this equation is something that has to be continuously restated. And so what I show is that the defense of meritocracy is a reaction, right, against efforts to democratize society, and efforts which take as their starting point not the level playing field of formal democracy, but actually existing historically accumulated advantages and disadvantages. Right? In other words, the claim to merit is a reactive expression of upper caste identity, right? And I think that we assume maybe too quickly that what we're witnessing in the early 21st century is the victory of capital, right? The victory of the powerful over the social democratic promise of the mid-20th century. And, it's certainly the case that much about social democracy and its promises have been dismantled. But I really do see this constant upper caste need for maneuver, right? And also the identitarian turn in upper caste politics as evidence of ongoing and effective pushback. And for me, this is really important to point out because it's a more properly historical account of caste relations in India, but also because it allows us to see the work that goes into the consolidation of caste power against the pressures of political opposition, right? So what I try to do in the book is kind of juxtapose the structural regularities of caste reproduction and the political processes of caste transformation, right? So that the struggle over rights and its power to shift elite strategies is always in view. And then the final big point is that difference at this scale, right, at the scale of kind of the upper versus the lower, and the defense of merit is not just about identity, right? It's also about reproducing upper casteness as property, by which I mean caste as a possession to be defended and a form of capital that can be accumulated, right? So across the book, I look at the life histories of IITians to show how the sort of shifting spaces of upper caste capital accumulation, from rural landholding to bureaucratic and public sector employment to managerial positions in the domestic private sector to corporate positions and kind of entrepreneurial success in the United States, that these shifts in spaces of upper caste capital accumulation are themselves a window onto shifting forms of upper caste maneuver against political opposition. They're also a window onto the changing political economy of development in India, right? And they let us see that the kind of career trajectories of IITians are a kind of bellwether for neoliberal political economic transformation. Okay, so I hope that gives you a better sense of the main arguments of the book. So now I'd like to read out two more excerpts to give you a sense of the kind of narrative texture of the book. And the first excerpt is from chapter 1, which sort of looks back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to understand how upper castes with no history of technical skill came to monopolize the engineering profession, right? And what I do, just to kind of give you a sense before I read, what I show in the chapter is that the growth of colonial era engineering depended on a distinction between the manual and the conceptual, right? Between artisanship and the professions. So in practice, what this meant was a shift from the shop floor to the classroom as the principal site of engineering education, and by extension, a targeting of literate upper castes, right, who were actually far less suited to technical practice, right? So in short, what the chapter demonstrates is that the value of engineering as a profession was intimately tied to its disassociation, right, from the tainted technical labor of lower castes. So I'm just going to read one section. Okay. Official testimonies to the Indian Industrial Commission of 1916 to 1918 show that upper caste Indians made the choice to enter engineering education with full regard for existing social distinctions. Arguments made by both British and Indian witnesses reflect two key concerns: that technical work was socially devalued, and that the way to enhance the value of the technical was to connect it to upper castes. At times, we see the role of caste in comparisons drawn between engineering colleges. In his testimony, B. Heaton, principal of the Sidhpur College of Engineering, contrasted Sidhpur's difficulties with recruiting upper caste students with the relative ease experienced by the College of Civil Engineering at Roorkee. The problem, as he diagnosed it, was with the structure of Sidhpur, which provided 3 tiers of training: one for officers, one for supervisors, and one for carpenters, blacksmiths, and tinsmiths from affiliated technical schools. Heaton observed that the fact of such social heterogeneity, quote, would make gentlemen who are capitalists chary of sending their sons to the college, unquote. Besides, he could not give them the kind of education they were accustomed to at home. Commensality came in for special mention. Heaton contrasted the situation at Sidhpur with that at Roorkee, quote, where the students live entirely separate lives, were expected to live in a good style, to dress for dinner. My students have a joint mess with sub-overseers and overseers, unquote. The institutional practice of co-dining across social divides was inimical to the effort to recruit Indian upper castes, who opted instead for institutions where caste practices of purity and pollution were maintained. Not only did maintaining status through practices of distinction vary across colleges, their graduates were also treated differently. Heaton observed that every person who graduated from Roorkee was guaranteed a job at the level of an assistant engineer, while only one of his 13 students was guaranteed a post at all. That technical education policy reinforced existing caste divisions is evident in another set of testimonies given to the Indian Industrial Commission by manual workers in artisanal industries. Deva Sigamani Achari, secretary of the Kumbakonam Vishvakarma Mahajana Conference Committee, came before the commission to speak on behalf of the artisans of the South, and to express his concern that technical education was marginalizing those very groups who came from histories of skilled manual labor. Although artisans were the industrial backbone of the country, he attested, they were not going to be the beneficiaries of the new policy. Achari singled out the state technical scholarships that sponsored students to go abroad for technical training as indicative of a larger problem, which was the prerequisite of formal education, which barred most artisans from accessing these scholarships. Rather than cultivate those who historically bore the weight of industry, and this is a quote from him, the mistake lay in the very first steps taken, that is, in the selection of students to go to foreign countries for training from communities other than industrial or artisanal classes, who possess the initial aptitude for manual labor, born of an inherited capacity and instinctive professional skill, which a university graduate of any other class despised as a derogation of his caste dignity or literary merit, unquote. To drive home his point about the injustices of favoring upper castes at the expense of artisans, Achari cited the 1911 census report on, quote, the complete disassociation of the intellectual class in the country from its industries. Manual work of any kind was looked upon as degrading, and the higher caste treated with contempt the artisans and craftsmen who carried on the industrial work of the country, unquote. It's evident from all of these statements that technical education was propagated in a context thick with assumptions about the value of labor and expectations that existing social distinctions of caste not be blurred with the advent of the new knowledge. British testimonies before the commission addressed the need to expand the scope of technical education by targeting upper caste groups, who, for social and professional reasons, would have opted instead for the law or humanities. They were clear that the appeal of technical education could not simply be assumed. In a context where the hierarchies of value worked against the hands-on character of engineering, its status had to be cultivated through active association with high status groups. As with Christian missionizing in the 19th century, an upper caste convert to the technical professions was the one most highly prized. Catering to upper caste did see results. While they did not go for anything that smacked of manual labor, upper castes were more enthusiastic about entering professional engineering programs that promised social status and well-paying careers. Indeed, the stratification of technical training was perfectly well suited to the upper caste desire to maintain social distinctions within native society while entering new modern forms of knowledge and bridging the racial gap in professional employment within the state. For their part, colonial officials were happy to accommodate caste prejudices in order to enhance the status and growth of engineering. In effect, upper caste prejudice and colonial policy dovetailed to consign those social groups with a history of technical skill to the margins of the growing field of engineering. So that's the first excerpt from from chapter 1. And I'd like to sort of end with a second excerpt, and this is from chapter 5 on the mass examination. And so what this chapter does is it sort of it talks about how the post-colonial mass examination was underwritten by an ideology of achievement, right? Where Unlike earlier selection processes that explicitly favored a high-born elite, now only individual ability would be tested, right? The individual ability was the only thing that mattered. But that in spite of this promise, right, that this would be a social leveler, we see from the social patterns of success and failure in the exam, we see from these patterns the endurance, right, the enduring power of historical inequalities. But that despite these evident patterns, the mass examinations still appear to exist above the political fray, right, as an objective instrument of evaluation. And the chapter then sort of goes on to focus on the IIT entrance exam as the most kind of fetishized example, right, of the mass examination, because of its massive pan-Indian scale and because of its fine-grained ranking, right? And the chapter also looks at the challenge posed by the exam coaching industry, right, which exploded in the 2000s and allowed new social groups to succeed in the JEE and enter the IITs. And so in response to the presence of these new social groups, a new binary, right, between the gifted and the coached has become commonplace in IIT Madras and has become a new way for upper caste IITians who have a shared history of education to reposition themselves, right, as the only true bearers of merit. So this section is from that chapter, and it's called The JEE Crisis and Calls for Reform. The coaching centers of Kota and Hyderabad have come in for critical scrutiny as the source of indebtedness, middle-class indebtedness or lower middle-class indebtedness, and the source of student suicides. Called coaching factories, their grueling routines are likened to the industrial shop floor, with students as grist for the mill of company profits. In Kota alone, the number of suicides reached a high of 30 in 2015 and prompted calls for reform. In response, some companies have established helplines for students to call for support. However, very little has changed in the daily routines of 12-hour non-stop study. For IIT managers, the coaching industry has been cause for different concerns. In a 2008 newspaper interview about the proliferation of coaching classes, IIT Madras's then director, M.S. Anand, clarified that he was, quote, looking for students with raw intelligence and not those with a mind prepared by coaching class tutors. The coaching classes only help students in mastering pattern recognition skills. With this, you cannot get students with raw intelligence, unquote. This notion of raw intelligence places the ideal IITian outside institutional or even social formation as a naturally gifted individual with a native capacity for technical knowledge. Raw intelligence is supposed to be an innate characteristic that cannot be acquired through training. In conversations with Anant and other IIT administrators, I heard their concerns that the coaching industry undermined the ability of the exam to test for those who were truly worthy. The perceived crisis produced by the expansion of coaching has generated calls for examination reform. The hope is that reforms might reinstate the exam as a true measure of merit, instead of just a measure of a student's ability to endure years of coaching. Some, like P.V. Indirasan, another former director of IIT Madras, have argued that given different circumstances, they would do away with the exam altogether. If I had my way, I would scrap the JEE in its present form because it has become a trainable exam, opined Indirasan. As long as one has the stamina and does not get bored, you can get through the JEE. To some extent, the coaching class syndrome and the willingness of the middle class student to devote 4 or 5 years of his life to this entrance exam is turning the JEE into more of a test of endurance than of intelligence or talent. But, Indirasan qualified, if the JEE is scrapped entirely, there could be political interference in IIT admissions, and that would be disastrous. This sense of being trapped between a rock and a hard place, with politics on one side and the market on the other, pervades IITian concerns about the transformation of the JEE. In June 2010, a panel set up to recommend reforms announced the JEE was to be renamed an aptitude test and would constitute only 30% of the admissions evaluation, with the school board exam results making up the remaining 70%. The move was highly controversial, fiercely debated, and ultimately not implemented. What's particularly significant about the sense of crisis around the JEE is that coaching is nothing new. In fact, it's as old as the exam itself. As early as 1962, Bombay's Agarwal classes made news when one of its students bagged the All India first rank in the JEE, making its center as the top destination for IIT aspirants. By the early 1980s, over 55% of students entering the IITs were Agarwal students. In the 1984 JEE, 84 Agarwal students secured ranks within the first All India 100. After Agarwal, a number of other coaching centers also came up, most importantly, its close competitor, Brilliant Tutorials, in 1970. IIT alumni from previous decades attested to the ubiquity of coaching. Swaminathan recalled that in his 1974 cohort, quote, the number of people who got in with low preparation was very low. Very, very few people got in, and all of them were in the low ranks. The top rankers, not one of them came in without a lot of exam prep. Jairam, a 1980s alumnus, concurred that, quote, everyone attended coaching classes, although many like him opted to do so through correspondence courses. But Jairam's everyone did not actually include all IITians. Pandya-Rajan, a 1970s backward caste alumnus from the town of Dindukal in southern Tamil Nadu, contradicted this assumption on the part of his peers from Chennai. He studied for the JEE on his own because there were no coaching classes where he lived. To give me a sense of the unevenness of coaching in his day, he laid out the channels into IIT Madras from different parts of Tamil Nadu. Compared to 5 students from all the 4 southern districts, there were 80 just from the city of Chennai. In other words, coaching in the 1970s was largely a metropolitan upper caste phenomenon. Pandya-Rajan further characterized this discrepancy in caste terms. Coaching was largely the monopoly of urban upper caste, with Tamil Brahmins being the best represented group. What's new then is not coaching itself, but the recent geographical and social expansion of the phenomenon. Now more and more students who might previously have thought the IITs out of their reach have turned to Kota and Hyderabad in hopes of admission. The mass marketing of coaching has rendered more permeable a social barrier to entry and generated acute anxieties among IITians about their claim to meritocratic exceptionalism. While calls for examination reform are one way that these anxieties are processed, there are others. Within Chennai, the rise of boutique coaching reinstates the distinction between upper and lower caste through differentiations of various sorts. By contrast to assessments of coaching factory students as instrumental and mechanistic, boutique students are characterized as cerebral and oriented towards the lofty ambition of mastering conceptual knowledge. While some of these distinctions and approaches to JEE coaching do hold, the contrast between the conceptual and the rote does much more than differentiate training. This difference in kind translates into a difference in status. Within IIT Madras, the distinction between the gifted and the coached is reproduced in everyday talk about training that indexes notions of caste and class difference. Moreover, such arguments about the conceptual versus the rote once again reprise older colonial distinctions between mental and manual labor, on the basis of which technical education was first stratified. So that's what I've got. I hope that was not too much. So let me turn it over to Manjri.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I think it definitely gives us all, something to build our own questions on. And I certainly have a lot of them for you. So I want to have my first question be about just meritocracy, right? What do we do with meritocracy, if anything at all? And I want to ask about that particularly in relation to reservations, which is certainly an issue that takes up, I feel like the most amount of space in caste-related debates. I think often with the result of shielding other issues or covering other issues. and preventing those from coming to the foreground. So my question is about something you say in the introduction, which is that, there's a sense in which the social life of meritocracy is such that it isn't possible to sever individual talent from, forms of social identity and inequality that exist, right? We can't sort of just reinvent meritocracy and say, let's have it be about individual talent, because as long as social inequality exists, that meritocracy will be marked by it, right? And you say, so then the only solution is to address those forms of social inequality as opposed to trying to find, other sorts of shortcuts. And I was wondering sort of where reservations, according to you, fit into that scheme of redressing those inequalities, and how large a role do they play exactly?
Yeah. So, look, I mean, reservations have obviously been a very important instrument of redistribution, right? I mean, it has allowed for it's been one mechanism for changing the social makeup, right, of higher education and of public sector employment, right? So that these spaces now do reflect the larger society, at least a little more than they used to, right? But even so, elite institutions, even public ones like the IITs, are still a very long way from actually reflecting the demographic weight of different groups in the wider society, right? So yes, I mean, reservations have gone some distance towards redressing these historical inequalities, that are still very much a structuring force, right, in contemporary Indian society. But yes, I mean, changing the composition of elite spaces, right, like the IITs, or even changing the composition of higher education, can't be the end goal of a kind of politics of redistributive justice, right? It can't be the end goal of a caste rights or an anti-caste politics, since only a small fraction of Indian society can even aspire, right, to join an institution like IIT Madras, right? But it's worth saying that India is actually all the sort of fierce debate around reservations would make you think that mechanisms of redistribution should be obsolete, when India is actually heading in the opposite direction, right? It's heading, away from redistributive justice and towards the far greater concentration of wealth in fewer hands, right? The rampant privatization of education, all in the name of the good life, right? Which is laughable. So I suppose reservation certainly has its limits, right, as a transformative mechanism, but it's a crucially important one. For redress in particular kinds of spaces, right? And granted, these are spaces of kind of middle class or sort of upper middle class access, right? And which leaves out huge swaths of Indian society, right? Now, I think the other thing I would say is that in addition to saying that what's actually needed is a sort of far more far-reaching anti-caste politics, right? That's about a more fundamental transformation in the distribution of material affordances and a transformation in the social hierarchies of value, right? That's what's actually needed. And I think the other thing that we see from the impact of reservations, right? I suppose in some ways the limited impact of reservations is that the right to higher education, right? The right to inhabit a space like IIT Madras doesn't in itself eradicate stigma, right? And we see this at in pretty much every institution where reservations have been implemented. We see that the quota category becomes a new site of stigmatization.
Right.
So students who get into these institutions, find themselves subject to all of these forms of stigma, right? They're assumed to be intellectually inferior. They're assumed to be undeserving. They're assumed to be taking a place that sort of that should have been taken by somebody who got in through the general category. So the reserved category has become a new site of stigmatization. And I think the only way to kind of address that and work against that is to continually reiterate, right, that people who get in through the general category get in not because they have some sort of innate talent and ability, but because they are the beneficiaries of historical privilege, right? Right? I mean, that needs to be kept in view all the time, right? That the sort of that there are collectives on both sides of the equation, right? It's not just that the reserved is a collective of lower undeserving, lower caste subject. The general is also a collective. It's a collective of people who have been long-standing beneficiaries of privileges, right, that have not been afforded to the other side, right? So
no, definitely. And so before I move on to my next question, I'm going to just start weaving in questions from the audience as well. So whatever feels relevant at whatever point, I'm just going to pick that up. But of course, we are going to answer all of your questions by the end of the session. That's what we've succeeded in doing in the past anyway. So let's hope that happens this time as well. But just to take Dhruv's question, which is about reservations, he says, don't you think only because of reservation, merit could never become a property of the reserved category? Because different categories have different cutoffs, reservation can never give the reserved category a merit. Because reservation has lowered the amount of hard work a student puts into an exam for different categories. So do you want to answer that question?
So, I mean, there's a kind of underlying premise to this question, which is that a cutoff rank in an exam like the JEE is an indicator of whether somebody is meritocratic or not, right? I mean, that itself is in some ways a byproduct, right, of this equation between being a member of the general category and having merit. I mean, what does that actually mean, right? What does it mean to have merit? And why is a rank in an exam an indicator, right, of merit? And here, merit, I think, is a stand-in for all sorts of things, right? Intellectual ability, social worth, deservingness, right? I mean, all of these things kind of are captured by this argument about who does or does not have merit, and it completely sidesteps, right, the question of why certain people are able to do well in an exam like the JEE in the first place, right? How does one explain the social patterns of failure and success in the exam? How does one explain the social patterns of who gets a certain rank and who does not, right? And the only way to explain those social patterns is by widening the frame beyond the exam itself, right? In order to understand that there's a much longer history, right? A longer history of inequality, right? That allows certain people to even take the exam, certain people to succeed in the exam, certain people to get a certain rank in the exam, right? All of this has to be kept in view. And to begin and end with the exam itself, right, disregards this much longer history of inequality. So in other words, the exam is actually the outcomes of the exam are symptomatic of this much longer history of inequality that stretches into the present, right? And that gives differently situated groups in Indian society, right, different means.
Yeah.
So I think one has to sort of think beyond the exam and properly situate the exam within this larger history of caste, right? Caste and class, to see how the exam, instead of correcting for those inequalities, actually reinforces them, right? That the ranking, in some ways, you can think about the fine-grained ranking of the JEE as itself a graded inequality of caste. Okay, I mean, that's what you're seeing in the rankings in the exam. You're seeing the operations of caste and its unequal outcomes, right? In the sphere of higher education, that's what you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And N says on the chat that to adding to what you've already said, to even know about the exam is part of the privilege, right? Of upper caste. So thanks for that. And let me now move on to my next question. And thank you to everyone who sent in their questions so far. And I'm going to keep picking them up as we go along. So my next question is about something that I've always found incredibly interesting, which is, to put it, generously. But I always find it so interesting that, Indians move abroad and they lay claims to resources, opportunities, even certain forms of progressive politics on the basis of a racialized identity, right, abroad. But that doesn't sort of come with an acknowledgement of caste realities back home in India, right? Or even from a self-reflexive perspective, more often than not, it doesn't involve thinking about how their own upper caste identity might have enabled their movement to, overseas in the first place, right? So I wanted to ask you, how can we think about this dynamic between race and caste? Because one would think that, by virtue of being a minority, a racial minority abroad, you would perhaps be forced to empathize with marginalized groups back home. But we see that doesn't happen a lot of the time. So how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, first off, let me just point out that among different nodes of the Indian diaspora, right, the US is by far the most affluent, right, and the most, and by extension also sort of the most homogeneous in caste terms, right? Not entirely so, but far more homogeneous than other sites, other diasporic locations, right? And this has to do with patterns of migration, U.S. immigration law, et cetera, right? So yes, I mean, Manjri, I think you're right. I mean, one would sort of assume that the experience of racial minoritization, right? The experience of certain forms of racial discrimination in the U.S. Might have produced a greater empathy, right, with minorities in the homeland, right? But as we know from various expressions of long-distance nationalism, this is not the case, right? I mean, more often the case is that diasporic minorities end up supporting even more stridently sometimes than people in the home country, end up supporting majoritarian nationalism, right, in the homeland. And this is certainly the case for the U.S. Indian diaspora. I mean, there's been a sort of outpouring of support for Hindutva politics, for the Modi government, and this support for Hindutva is it's an expression both of sort of caste belonging and caste sentiments that have carried over, right, from sort of homeland to diaspora. So it's an expression of those forms of belonging. But yes, it's also a sort of an expression of racial minority identity, right, in the U.S. And one instance, and this expression of racial minority identity and of religious minority identity, has gone so far as to, as to completely denying the existence of caste, right? So, which is sort of ironic given the makeup of the diaspora, right? So, we saw this kind of denial of caste in, I'll give you just one example. In 2005, there was this controversy around the representation of Hinduism in textbooks in Californian public schools. And a group of Hindu organizations came forward to complain about the portrayal of Hinduism in these textbooks, and especially objected to the mention of caste and gender, right? Of kind of caste hierarchies and gender hierarchies within Hinduism. And these complaints were advanced in the name of wounded racial and religious minority sentiment, right? And California, the state of California, was charged with trying to divide the Hindu community and with sort of denigrating religious minority sentiment, right? And so right there, you see this kind of reframing of the issue, right? Not as one of kind of enduring inequalities, right, within Indian or Hindu society, but as a kind of affront, right, to upper caste Hindus who are now the victims, right? They're the victims of a kind of a white majority culture, right? They've been denied their dignity, et cetera, et cetera. And there have been similar efforts to squash the addition of caste to non-discrimination policies in the US and the UK, right? Where again, Hindu groups have contested the very mention of caste, right? As an affront, right? To their religious minority sentiments. Now, one really interesting thing that I want to point to is that the same groups who do this typically support affirmative action in the US, okay? They support affirmative action in the US, and while at the same time opposing reservation policies in India and objecting to the very mention of caste, right, as a kind of constitutive element in diasporic society. So how do they do this? I mean, how is this kind of distinction, or how do these two stances come together? And what I've heard from my interviewees is that for them, affirmative action policy in the US is consistent with liberal democracy, right? Because it's about the right of institutions to handpick uniquely deserving individuals, right? Sort of exceptional individuals from underrepresented groups, right? And so in this way, it's sort of consistent with a kind of liberal democratic norm, right, of favoring individual ability over and above group identity, right? As opposed to reservations in India, which are about quotas, right? Quotas which, the argument for which is very different, right? It's about a corrective to historical injustice, right? Through the compensatory discrimination in favor of previously disadvantaged populations, right? So, and this is precisely what groups in the Hindu diaspora, Hindu upper caste diaspora, object to, right? Is treating affirmative action as a historical corrective and using the quota, right, as a sort of mechanism. They object to that, but they don't mind the kind of handpicking of exceptional individuals, because for them this is consistent with meritocracy, right?
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I really find it incredibly, amusing, and thank you for sharing that with us. So I see we've been flooded with questions, right? So what I'm going to do is, just in the interest of optimizing for time, I'm going to draw on those questions that don't talk about the IIT or reservation at the moment. And then towards the end of our discussion, we can return to the questions about IIT and reservations. And I can sort of maybe group some of them together just to sort of make sure that we're able to move through them fairly swiftly. But this means I'm going to have to stop taking questions just to be able to answer the ones that we already have and to give you enough time to be able to answer them as best as you can. So sorry, guys. I mean, we're definitely going to answer the questions that we already have, but we can't, take new ones at the moment. The next question is from Diksha. She says, reading both your books together, I was wondering if there's, so I think the other book she's talking about is Shorelines, which is about space and rights in South India. So she says, reading both your books together, I was wondering if there is a contrast between how the state constituted community development in relation to fishermen, as opposed to the idea of an individual in higher education or engineering. Do these lead to different distributions of caste manifestations? What I'm trying to ask is whether caste is the same across your two books.
Okay. I mean, certainly both books express the same sets of analytical concerns, right? So, one is the sort of historicity of caste, right? Caste as something which has been transformed over time, right? And transformed, especially, I mean, the other thread that runs through both books is I'm really interested in how caste is deployed, right, as an instrument of governance, right, of capitalist transformation. I'm less concerned with caste as a kind of marker of cultural difference, right, something that is kind of sort of emblematic of Indian cultural difference or something like that, right? And it's much more concerned with the sort of operationalizing of caste, right? In certain kinds of state and capitalist projects, and also in projects of political rights, right? I mean, how does caste manifest in all of these different ways? In that sense, I think it's very similar. The two books do similar things with caste. Now, the first book is on a sort of subaltern population, and the second book is on a kind of, it's on the other end of the caste spectrum, if you will, right? But despite that difference, both books are really concerned with a kind of dialectics, right, of democratization. In other words, both books are really interested in how contestation, political contestation, right, over the meanings and practices of caste have been sort of emblematic to Indian democracy, right? And how, you can't think about sort of subalterns in isolation, for instance, from forms of caste power. And similarly, you can't think about upper caste in isolation from subaltern pushback. So in both of the texts, there's this, I'm trying to stage this kind of the interaction between differently positioned social groups, right? And that interaction is precisely what drives, right, democratization as a process. I think in that sense, both books are quite similar. Also, although at first glance they may be dealing with very different subject matter, right?
Yeah. Great. So our next question is from N, who says, could you speak a bit about your method and access to elite spaces? Even as researchers with elite identities, it's something quite difficult to gain access. What was your experience like?
Yeah, so I mean, this is another big difference between the first and second book, right? Not just levels of access, but also the sort of complexity of my own positionality as a researcher, right, and in relation to my ethnographic subjects. So in the first book, I mean, I was dealing with a subaltern population. I began my interest in them and their politics began via activism. That I was kind of involved in fisheries rights activism, and that was my sort of point of entry into the first book. And I mean, what was interesting is that in that case, I felt very strongly politically identified with the community that I was studying, even though they saw me as a rank outsider, right? They couldn't figure out what the hell I was doing there, right? So I was constantly being asked about my presence, my agenda, et cetera, right? And by contrast, in this project, it was almost the sort of reverse, right? Where I felt a certain kind of critical, even sort of oppositional stance to some of my research subjects, whereas they saw me as sort of as one of theirs, right? Even though I'm not an engineer, obviously, but my name, my pedigree, the fact that I read as upper caste, I think gave me a certain degree of access that perhaps I otherwise would not have had. Now, I don't know if the person who asked the question is a researcher. I mean, it sounds like perhaps you are, maybe you're even an anthropologist. The other big difference between the two books is that in the first one, I did the kind of immersive research that is typically associated with being an anthropologist, right? Like I lived in Kanyakumari district for almost 2 years. I mean, there was a historical dimension to the project, but the ethnographic part was very much about this kind of immersive fieldwork. But, that was before I had children. And the second project, when I was conducting the research, I had a 4-year-old and a 6-month-old. And, that meant that I couldn't do the kind of research that I did in the first book, right? So the second book is mostly based on interviews and on archival materials. I did sort of attend events and stuff on the campus, but I didn't live on the campus. And there just wasn't, that possibility just didn't arise because of my personal circumstances. And so that's something to keep in mind, that life intervenes and you change, you have to change your method. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Great. So there are 2 questions that I'm going to take together, and I'm going to simplify them as much as possible. But feel free to ask me if you'd like me to repeat either of them. Okay. But I feel like they complement each other. So I think you won't struggle too much with transitioning from one to the other. Okay. So Vivi asks, are there any ways in which the modern capital of Brahmins can be invested positively into society, other than understanding the responsibility to shed privilege, share space, etc.? So that's one question. And Rishi has a question which says, as an ex-untouchable, how do I introduce dominant caste privilege in a conversation without making it confrontational and facing a deluge of upper caste arrogance? So, yeah.
I mean, the two sort of pair very nicely, as you said, Manjari. Look, I think what the second question puts on the table is that a kind of upper caste reckoning with privilege and with the inheritances of caste has to be a starting point for any expression of solidarity or any sort of participation in a collective project of democratization, right? that has to be a starting point. In response to the first question, if there's any sort of positive work to be done, I don't think it can be done in the name of patronage, right? So a kind of philanthropic approach, where we pat ourselves on the back for doing whatever it is. That's inadequate, right? So how does one redistribute capital, right? I don't think that this is something that, to be truly transformative, I don't think that this is something that can happen at the level of the individual, right? I mean, it requires structural transformation, right? And structural transfer and a scale of structural transformation that honestly can only be advanced by the state. So expecting a kind of private sector philanthropy to do this work I think is incredibly short-sighted. So neither the sort of individual as the kind of vehicle of social change, nor the private sector as a vehicle of social change is adequate. Right? It has to be a much more sort of far-reaching, state-driven project where, again, the kind of collective inheritances of caste are mitigated, right, by a redistribution of resources. So, I suppose that's what I would say. That this is the kind of redistributive justice that one imagines as being the basis for the creation of a truly kind of casteless or anti-caste society has to have the state as a key kind of instrument, but also that for upper caste to participate in such a project, requires a sort of a real, honest process of reckoning with one's own privileges, right, and inheritances, right? So we stop thinking about our success as something that is self-made, right, as something that we deserve, that we are beneficiaries. And the reason why I bring the state into view the way I have is also as a way of saying, look, upper castes haven't accrued the kinds of capital that they have all on their own, right? I mean, the state has been a key ally, right, to the project of upper caste capital accumulation, right? A key ally. And so, that's also something to recognize. And it's especially important because you have so many kind of sort of private sector. The IITs I interviewed are sort of perfect examples of this, right? I mean, they are key beneficiaries of the developmental state, right? The IITs are public institutions. The majority of upper caste IITians come from families of civil servants. So these are people who have populated the state, who have benefited from the state in a very direct way, right? Yeah. And they're the first ones to disavow the state, right? I mean, these are people who have not only disavowed the state, but have been, very kind of fervently pushing a project of neoliberal transformation, of kind of deregulation, privatization, etc. So, recognizing that, that as upper caste, we have been privileged not just by caste, but by the state, right? I think is important. And yeah, I mean, to the second question, I don't know. I mean, I hear the same frustration expressed by, racial minorities in the U.S., right? This kind of frustration in the face of like shrill defensiveness, right, on the part of white people, right, and an unwillingness to even like enter the conversation honestly. And I mean, frankly, I think it's high time that white people and upper castes kind of had this conversation amongst themselves instead of having Dalits or Black people constantly force the issue because it's exhausting, and it's not their job.
Yeah. And I mean, the link that I see between the answers you gave, sorry, to both questions, is the idea that, part of the reason why these conversations are not happening within those groups themselves is because they don't even think of themselves as having a caste, right? Like you were saying earlier, the castelessness of the upper castes, where caste only becomes a defining feature of lower castes in some sense. And so that goes back to what you were saying about how that reckoning is so important as a starting point, because without that, you don't think of yourself as part of that system to begin with, even. So thank you for those questions. And so I'm going to ask my last question before moving on to some more from the audience, because I think this is an important one. So there's a part in your book where you talk about, how the lower castes resorted to rights-based discourse while the upper castes resorted to merit, right? And I know you don't draw that binary, right? But what I'm interested in is the increasing packaging of merit as right? So you see this maybe in the case of your book with the Tamil Brahmins at the IITs. Even white lives matter, like that is a very strong packaging of privilege as a right, as bizarre as that sounds. How do we make sense of that? Because clearly rights-based discourse is being co-opted in these instances. So while the terms of the discourse might belong to the marginalized who've been arguing for their rights for a very, very long time, those very terms are being used by those who are using them to deny the rights of those who brought those terms into focus, right? So
this is one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is look at the transformation in kind of upper caste self-definition, right? From a more kind of universalistic self-conception as casteless, as unmarked, right? As inhabiting a kind of modern subject position, right? Where caste has been transcended, right? A shift from that to a much more identitarian, explicit embrace of caste as the basis of rights, right? This kind of this shift from the kind of comfortable inhabitation of an unmarked norm to this defensive claim to caste, but not as privilege, right? Caste as a right and even as a basis of victimhood, right? That is something that itself is a byproduct of this kind of larger process of democratization, right? It's precisely as a kind of reaction to a sort of expanding lower caste rights politics, right? And a sense of one's entitlements being taken away, right? A sense of having been forced out into the open, right? So the Tamil Brahmin case is really interesting in this regard, because what Dravidianism did is it forced into the open, right, the inheritances of caste that explained the kind of Brahmin monopoly of certain spaces, right, like central government employment or the professions. And the reaction to that was for Tamil Brahmins to much more kind of explicitly claim their own caste identities and to make them the bases of merit. So it was both a kind of claim to a kind of superiority, right, as meritocratic subjects, and a claim to victimhood at the very same time, right? So the sort of claim to merit as a right and as a property was also expressing this kind of new sense of being victims, right? Of being victims of this sort of kind of a lower caste, of the rise of lower caste politics, right? And you see this in, say, think back to the 1990s when the Mundell Commission's recommendations were first implemented. I mean, you had upper caste students kind of masquerading as sweepers and cobblers and this kind of thing, sort of masquerading, performing their reduction to lower caste labor, right? And saying this was a huge injustice against them, right? And think about that, right? The idea that a mechanism of redistribution is experienced as victimhood, right? So you become the new victims. You can see this. I mean, in the U.S., it's very similar, where if you look, for instance, at the backlash against affirmative action, right? It's a very different position from an earlier moment of support for affirmative action, right? The earlier moment was one when, you had kind of this comfortable inhabitation of an unmarked norm, which allowed for these sort of expressions of beneficence, right? You're able to incorporate a few from among the disadvantaged. But the backlash against affirmative action has been in the name of white victimhood, right? That white people have been unfairly denied access to institutions that they should, by virtue of being who they are, have a right, right? And that's a much more kind of identitarian framing, right, of racial identity there and of caste identity here. I mean, you even have sort of arguments now for a Brahmin quota, right? Which again, and I've done this talk. There's a previous talk I did at the Bangalore International Center, and my Twitter feed exploded, right, with comments from people who were saying, everything from like Brahmins are the new Dalits, to Hindu identity is being undermined. So very much about each of these is very much about a kind of identitarian reaction as Hindus, as upper caste, as Brahmins, right? I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. So we have a couple more questions. I'm quite confident if we take them two at a time, we can speed through them a little bit and maybe not be any more than a couple of minutes over time. So I'm going to simplify them as much as possible. Ashutosh asks, have you seen similar zealous protection of caste privilege or merit in other streams of higher education? So liberal arts or commerce, etc. Then Nandita asks about, she says that, the gender gap somehow seems to be more readily acknowledged at the IITs than the caste gap. But of course, the concept of merit is used here in a skewed way as well. So did you see any correlation, intersection, opposition between caste and gender at the IITs? So you can answer these two first,
All right. Let me take up the gender one first. So, I mean, it was interesting, IIT Madras, the percentage of women has never exceeded 10, right? So it's an overwhelmingly male campus. And that fact, of it being overwhelmingly male is thrown into even sort of greater relief when you compare it to Anna University, which is the regional engineering colleges, which is literally across the street, right, from IIT Madras, where the percentage of women is almost 50, right? So it's not that women don't go for engineering; it's that the IITs have been especially sort of exclusive or exclusionary in the way, yeah. So I did expect, I did go in thinking that gender would be more of an arbiter, right, of merit, right? That gender would be more of a basis for the kind of differential evaluation of merit, and found that that was not the case, right? So, and you know, when I spoke to men, I also interviewed women. Typically, what was said to explain the sort of paucity of women students was that, you know, families are traditional. They don't want their girls to go to coaching classes, which often are on the other side of the city, and and stretch late into the night. And so there were all of these kind of structural constraints that were pointed to explain the few numbers of women. It was never about intellectual ability, right? That was never pointed to as the source of the problem, right? And this was in sharp contrast to what was said about lower castes, right? That this was about intellectual ability, that this was about the inability to compete, that this was about, you know, some kind of like innate failing. So that was quite interesting, and that these sentiments were echoed both by men and women, right? Who identified as upper caste. Yeah. In terms of other streams of hierarchy, I mean, this is not something I've looked at myself. I mean, you know, if you look, for instance, at the recent sort of kind of conflagrations on central government campuses across the board, right? Whether it's JNU or the University of Hyderabad or IIT Madras, I mean, what you're seeing is a kind of confrontation, right, between a recently expanded lower caste population, right, sort of post 2008 when the OBC quota was implemented. The percentage of OBCs and SCs together has really kind of expanded considerably, right, at these institutions. And this is not just engineering colleges. And what that's done is it's both afforded lower castes more of a basis. They're now a critical mass, right, who are more able to sort of effectively challenge the upper caste culture of their campuses, right? Mm-hmm. And have done so through a variety of ways, right? Like starting new associations, like the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle, right, at IIT Madras, or the APSC has kind of sister institutions across all of these campuses, right? And so you're having it's a more kind of openly politicized, lower caste student body that is making its presence felt. And on the other side, you know, especially after the election of Modi, you have a much more openly Hindutva aligned, right, upper caste student population, and the sort of confluence of these two things, right, has made these campuses new sites of incredibly sort of sharp and often violent polarization, right? And what you're seeing is that, you know, administrations have aligned themselves with the Modi government, you know, to try to suppress dissent, to try to kind of put a lid on these forms of kind of lower caste opposition, and try to once again reinforce, right, the upper caste culture of these campuses. Mm-hmm. So I suppose, you know, this is a kind of long-winded way of saying that a lot of the same kinds of dynamics are present, not just on engineering college campuses, but on other kinds of campuses as well, right? Other spaces of higher education.
Right. Okay, so our last three questions, I'm going to shorten and share them with you. The first question is about the UPSC, which is similar in sort of difficulty and exclusivity to the JEE. And sorry, I can't remember the name of the person who asked this question. I'm really, really sorry because I dismissed the question after I wrote it down. But so they're asking, you know, the UPSC has been seen as a tool for social mobility and for developing state capacity, right? So how well does that perhaps serve that purpose, and might there be a better way of achieving those purposes? And should I move on to my next question?
Sure. Yeah. Are these the last two?
So there's two more.
Okay.
Yeah. Andrew's question is that on the one hand, it's often argued that reservation leads to incompetency, right? But on the other hand, you have elite institutions priding themselves on their ability to make people competent, right? To produce skilled doctors, engineers, etc. So how does the ideology of meritocracy square with the idea of inherent competency and inherent competence and taught competence? Was Andrew's question. And should I pose the last one as well?
Is that okay? Yeah, sure. Yes.
Just one more. Okay.
Yeah.
So Mathu's question is, increasingly we see IIT Merit transforming itself because of affirmative action. So it seems to have moved from fully pro-public sector companies to fully private MNCs for jobs post-graduation, which brings about the question of whether this merit is seeping into Silicon Valley. And do you think caste has become more visible in the US, in college towns as well?
Okay. Okay. So the UPSC, I mean, the UPSC is a really interesting, I mean, it's not just a precursor because it still exists, but there's an interesting link between the UPSC and the JEE. So, you know, one of the ways that I think success in the exam becomes the, becomes the kind of privilege of a particular sort of caste segment of the population is in part because they come from families where their parents did the UPSC. Right. So as I said, you know, a lot of these students are themselves the children of civil servants, right? And mostly not members of the state civil services, but of the central services, right? So these are families who, in some sense, you know, come from a tradition of exam coaching and preparation, right? I mean, the need to be a kind of competitive student, you know, who does well, who has a kind of familiarity with a technical instrument like an examination, and who's able to succeed in the examination, is itself something which has been kind of handed down, right? So the kind of link between the UPSC and the JEE can be thought of as a kind of generational link, right? Between a kind of parental generation that succeeded in one exam and passed that ability on to the next generation that succeeded in another exam, right?
Right.
Now, yes, it's absolutely true, and this kind of links to the last question. It's absolutely true that, you know, a tiny fraction of IITs now go into public service, right? It just doesn't happen anymore. It's because it's not lucrative to do so. Most of them go into private sector jobs. For a while, these were in either education or business in the US. But of course, increasingly, there's a trend of people staying in India, right? And going into the domestic private sector. And often this is multinational companies that are based in India, right? So and what that's done, what this kind of exit to the private sector has done and of course, this exit to the private sector has happened at the same time that you've had reservations having more of an impact on the public sector, right? So what that's done is it's kind of reinforced this idea that somehow the private sector is cost-free, right? Because it's outside the scope of reservations, and the public sector, by contrast, is cost-ridden, right? And of course, this is a kind of shorthand for lower cost entering the public sector, right? I mean, that's what makes them seem cost-ridden, and the fact that the private sector is overwhelmingly upper cost makes it seem cost-free. So there again, you have this kind of sectoral division between the private and the public, being an index of a cost division, right? And helps to once again reinforce this idea that somehow upper costs are costless, right? Because they inhabit the cost-free private sector, right? So, Silicon Valley's successes have been a key driver of aspiration among IIT alumni, right? So, when I talked to students at IIT Madras in the 2000s, like most of them, when I asked them, like, who are your role models, right? I mean, I did interviews with IITians all the way through, right? Like from the first graduating class to almost all the way through the 2000s. And it's interesting, like the answer to this question kept changing, right? So no one in, who graduated in the 1960s or 70s said, oh, my role model is an entrepreneur, right? It was always, a kind of a researcher within higher education, or somebody who had gotten a kind of lifetime job in some good company. Now it's the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, right? So, I mean, the sort of the model of who is the meritocratic IITian has really shifted and is continuing to shift, right? So the entrepreneur, the diasporic entrepreneur, is the kind of a new paragon, right, of merit, of a kind of upper cost merit. But that this is a cost subject, that the Silicon Valley IITian entrepreneur is a cost subject, is not visible in the US in the way that it is here, right? So there is a difference in the way this person is perceived and received in the two contexts. The final thing about meritocracy and competency is a really interesting question, because yes, I mean, what has the expansion of reservations within the IITs done to the institution's claim to be producing competency overall, right? And I think, in a way, there's a kind of lively discourse within the IITs about who the ideal IITian is, right? Is this somebody who comes in with a sort of already innate talent for certain forms of knowledge? Or is this somebody who learns to be a certain kind of person at the IITs? And what I heard over and over and over again was a kind of naturalization of merit as something that people come into the institutions with, right? And their success in the exam is the most obvious index of that kind of natural merit, right? That sort of inbuilt form of intelligence, right? And what they do at the IITs is not really learn. I mean, they kind of learn, but what they really do is kind of, express these natural talents, right? They express them. So I heard so many people saying to me, yeah, we learn things in classes, but really the real learning was outside of the classroom, right? In our interactions with our peers, right? With our sort of equally brilliant peers. So it's in this kind of, this idea of soaking up the brilliance of your peers and being in this environment where sort of everybody was already in sort of already a fully formed intellect. That's what that was the real benefit of the IITs, right? So that's kind of what's being conveyed, and you can see this in a sense in the way the private job recruitment process happens, right? So increasingly, you're seeing job recruiters only recruiting general category students, right? Who they read as upper caste, right? Like assuming that they're the only ones who are the legitimate bearers of the IIT pedigree, right? So, and I think that this kind of two-tier form of employment where only certain people are seen as proper IITians and others are not, is only going to get worse. Which is another way of saying, those who come in not already innately gifted and who are simply taught by the institution are not as valid, right, as those who come in innately gifted, and the institution is simply a space for them to kind of socially network, right?
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's end with that. I think we covered a lot of ground today. Thank you so much for talking about all of this with us. And I'm certainly going to leave the session more knowledgeable about caste and merit. Do you have any closing line you would like to share?
I'm all talked out. This is really enjoyable. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to have a conversation. Books are not, it's a medium that circulates slowly, and mine is a pretty big book, so I don't expect everyone to go out and read it. So it's really nice to have an opportunity like this to sort of convey some of the arguments and be in conversation with people, right, who may not ever read the book.
Yeah. No, we're glad we could make this conversation happen. And thank you to everyone who joined us today and who has stuck with us till the very end. We seem to be getting some positive feedback. Nishant says, listening to Dr. Ajantha has been amazing. Now more excited to pick up her book. Vivi says, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Yeah, thank you all. And if any of you or Ajantha, you have any feedback for us at Belongg regarding this session or any of our other sessions, feel free to share that with us. You can write to me at manjari@belongg.net or hit us up on any of our social media. Yeah, great.
Bye.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Manjari.